A vigil was held in Texas yesterday to remember the Liberian national, Thomas Eric Duncan, who became the first person diagnosed with Ebola in the United States, as a nurse in Spain became the first diagnosed case in Europe. The case has raised concerns that someone with Ebola had been able to fly out of one of the quarantine countries in Western Africa. In Liberia, the country's president said that she was cautiously optimistic that the worst of the outbreak was over, but that medical aid from the outside was getting into the country too slowly.
We just need to see a little bit faster action, that's all. But certainly in terms of resources, both human and financial, as well as material, I think the response is well appreciated and is very good. We'd like to speed it up.
On Wednesday, the World Health Organization said that Ebola had claimed the lives of over 3,000 people, with over 8,000 confirmed cases worldwide. Nathaniel Sansom, the report.
Well, in the studio to discuss today's news is James Schneider, Editor-in-Chief at Think Africa Press. James, the Ebola outbreak, it started as an Africa story, but it's now a global story, isn't it?
It is, but it's still primarily, I think, an Africa story. I mean, yes, there's those vigils taking place, but if we look at the global response that's happening to it, it's not as if Britain is sending 750 troops to Texas, it's sending them to Sierra Leone. And whilst, some of the more hysterical bits in the media, like CNN, have tried to really amp it up as a sort of American threat, it's still really primarily an African story. That's where it's got the most effect. And that's also where the resource is going to, because really the odd case in Spain and the odd case in the US, they already have all of the health systems to stop it spreading, because Ebola is not actually terribly contagious. The window in which it is contagious is reasonably small. It's just this one has got slightly out of control, which is why it's so much larger than the other ones. So they should be able to keep this, contain this in the US. They should be able to contain it in Spain in exactly the same way that they were able to in Nigeria. There's now, touch wood, no Ebola in Nigeria.
So your tone here is very different to the coverage in the press. I mean, we're seeing reports saying this is the worst thing since HIV/AIDS and so on. So do you think that the politician we quoted in the package there from Africa is saying this has peaked? Is that right?
I couldn't tell you whether it's peaked. At the moment, most of the health experts say that it hasn't peaked, that it's still, that perhaps in Guinea and Sierra Leone, the rate of increase has slowed, but it's still increasing. So like the second derivative is now not as high as it was before. But in Liberia, it's still going up. It's still a huge problem. I'm just saying that as a kind of problem outside of the three countries that are affected, or the three countries that are primarily affected, it's not this terrible thing. So, CNN might say, is Ebola the new ISIS, or is it the ISIS of disease? I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, there's a lot of scaremongering and hyperbole that's going out there.
So interestingly, where it's been stopped, how has it been stopped?
Well, in Nigeria, it was stopped by finding out what the first case was very early, isolating it, and finding out everyone who'd been contacted and putting them in quarantine. And at each new case, everyone who'd been contacted put them in quarantine. And they've had large national hygiene campaigns, but basically it's been about isolating the cases, making sure that there isn't too much contact, and lots of soap and rubber gloves and suits. That's pretty much how you do it if it stayed at a small scale, as it always did in Nigeria. The problem in Liberia is that you can't possibly, at the moment, isolate and find every single case. When in Nigeria, the number of cases are under 100, you can find everybody that 100 people have contacted in the last week. You can't when you're now in the thousands.
So what we're saying about the sort of fundamental causes here, because there's been a lot of talk about how it's a uniquely contagious disease. You're saying perhaps that isn't the case, and also a lot of talk about how there hasn't been vaccines for it, and there aren't enough vaccines even where they've existed. But you're saying something different, that this is more about poverty and health infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yes, it is a horrible disease that kills a very high number of people. But, you've probably seen in the media some saying 50, some saying 90. You can see the difference in the response between the different countries, that the death rate has been higher or lower, because it is about medical response. It's also about information response, because we shouldn't just be viewing the health system as a kind of technical response that can just be brought out of the box and fixed. It needs to be placed within the social context of wherever it is being placed, and that has to. So, for example, part of the reason why it's been worse in Liberia than elsewhere, and the death rate has been higher, I think has been the government's response has been quite aggressive towards its citizenry. And that sort of perhaps mimics some of the authoritarianism within that government relative perhaps to that in Sierra Leone. And so that has made people less likely to go to a health clinic, which means if they get there later, they're more likely to die. So yes, it is contagious, but it's not enormously contagious. The antibacterial, soap kills it. It's not airborne. You can't just get it if I have it in my body, but I don't have the symptoms. If I touch you now, there's no problem. It doesn't pass that way.
That's very interesting. Does let me ask you a bit, because you touched on there about the sort of authoritarian response in some cases, and we've heard of whole sort of towns being quarantined and curfews and so forth. And you're saying really that's counterproductive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the way in which it is brought under control is with good relations between the citizens and the health authorities, because what is needed from the health authorities' perspective is for any citizen who thinks they might have it to immediately identify them and to cooperate, and that to be that relationship. If any bits of the citizenry think they're under assault from the government, from the outside world, from health authorities, then they aren't going to go to health authorities, they're going to run away, then will infect more people, and so the thing spreads.
OK, James Schneider from Think Africa Press, thanks for that. Well, that's all we have time for in this part of the programme, but do rejoin us after the break when we'll be looking at the Sun's new campaign against the Islamic State. Stay with us.